Welcome to Hope for Nutley's speaker series, Hope Speaks. This program offers viewers an insight into important issues that affect our youth and their families. Our interviews feature stories and testimonies from those who have suffered through addiction, those who lost someone to addiction, counselors, clergy, and other contributors who can help offer support, understanding, information, and insight to those in need. HOPE, which stands for Helping Our Parents Endure, was founded in 2008 by Commissioner Petracco as a local community initiative to provide parents, guardians, and loved ones with the education and tools necessary to prevent substance abuse and the strength, support, and courage to find help when it's needed.
Thanks. It's really great to be here tonight. Thank you to Sam Carell for setting this up, Lisa Casilli, Liz Marquez, and everyone from the Municipal Alliance who invited me to come here to speak. I am a Nutley native, grew up in Nutley, class of 85, so it's really nice to be back again to speak to you about this. I'm a psychiatrist that specializes in addiction. My offices are in New Brunswick, as was mentioned, because I'm part of Rutgers. And I'm going to give an overview basically about understanding some concepts of addiction related to the brain and how the teen brain is particularly vulnerable to substance use. I'm going to speak a little bit about specific drug examples, but not to any great extent. Can you hear me okay? Mic on? Oh, sorry, I didn't turn it on. Thank you. It's on it. I was just saying I'm not going to really speak to a lot of specific drug examples, but there's plenty of time at the end for questions, and I welcome your questions. You can ask me specific drug examples if you want to, in case I don't go over them in the presentation. So this is fun. We're going to spend some time learning about the brain, which of course is the central computer, the nervous system for our body. It's only about 3 pounds, but it's so amazing in terms of its complexity. And the main cell of the brain, of course, is the neuron. And something that people don't realize is that your brain really is changing for a good part of your life. You're not born with a final brain. There's quite a bit of routing and rerouting that goes on even into adulthood. So just to give you some perspective about this, when you're born, your brain is only about 60% of the size that it will be when you are an adult. In the first 3 months, the size doubles, and by age 3, it's about 80% of its adult size. So the first stage of brain development is just in terms of growth, where there is overproduction of neurons and just increase in size. The human brain, just to remind everybody, is pretty different than other species, and this is just showing a rat brain in comparison to remind everyone that really what makes us human, one of the main distinctions is in this part of the brain, which is called the cerebral cortex. That's the part of our brain that's so much bigger than other species, where it's big and thick and complicated. And that's the reason as humans, we have algebra, and we can plan a birthday party, and we have language, things that animals don't have because of the functions of this part of our brain. The basic functions of survival are actually similar among species, but this part of the brain, of course, is what distinguishes us as humans. So I'm going to use some scientific words. So just to clarify, neuron is just the cell, the name of the cell in the system. The axon is the tail that carries the information for the neuron. The synapse is the space between the neurons. So just to make you sort of familiar with some of the basic terms. So this is kind of a key point, that even though we're born with a lot of neurons and neurons are growing when we're young, that the key aspect of maturation that happens in the brain is called myelination. This is the most important thing. What happens is throughout our lives, our bodies are making this stuff called myelin, which is kind of like a rubbery material. And that's like an insulator for part of the neuron. And it speeds the transmission of the information. So through this insulating system, the electrical response can go much faster, and that's a key part of development. In fact, every childhood milestone, when your child first crawls or walks or speaks, is actually due to myelination. It's showing that myelination of a new section of the brain has been completed, and that's consistent kind of with all the developmental milestones of childhood. But in fact, what we sometimes forget, what I have to remind my 18-year-old daughter, is that the brain is actually not done with this process until the age of 25. Your brain is continuing to grow and develop and myelinate essentially to the age of 25. So when you think about the vulnerability of substance use, the impact of a junior high student or high school student, their brain is not yet fully developed, and so there's already there a vulnerability where, not only is the substance bad in the ways that would be bad for an adult, but it can really impact on this critical period of brain development. So in addition to myelination, we talked about just the growth of cells in big numbers, which happens about till the age of 12. So just the number of cells or neurons is growing as the size of the brain is growing. Your brain's getting bushier in terms of all of these cells and the connections between them increasing. What really happens after 12 is a different process called pruning. So now that all the cells have been made, there's kind of all this fine-tuning that happens from 12 to 25, where actually there's kind of the circuits are being laid down, and then the extra ones are being discarded. And that process is called pruning, and that seems to be really important in the final maturation of the brain. So for example, if this is what you're born with, this is a slide just showing some of the cells, you can see how there's all this rapid growth and development that happens when you're 6, 7, 8, 9. And then what happens is, you see it looks like there's less cells as the brain is finally maturing through the last step. So the first step is all this rapid growth. The second step is all this stuff called pruning, which is really fine-tuning the networks. Just to point out, again, it's not really done until the age of 25. So as the brain is pruning, it's finishing, as I mentioned, this myelination process, this rubbery stuff. Who cares? It's covering the neurons, it's making the transmissions faster. And again, you could think of it this way as kind of the superhighways. When you think about your cognitive capacity, your ability to think and to solve problems, it really is true that in the teen years up to 25, that's where you're able to handle more sophisticated tasks, more complex tasks, because the most developed parts of your brain are the last to mature. And so this process, again, is improving your thinking ability, your planning, what's called your executive functioning, and that's happening throughout the teen years. Okay, so what's one of the most important parts about understanding this? Well, it just turns out by chance that your brain matures from the back to the front. That's the process, that's how it happens in nature. So the very last part of your brain to mature is this part, which is a really important part called the frontal cortex. In fact, out of all the parts that make us human, the frontal cortex really is the key defining measure that you don't really see in other animal species. So this is really the last part of your brain to mature. Why does that matter? Well, this is the part of your brain that's involved in judgment, reasoning, complex problem solving, rational decision making, using logic. It's also your stop mechanism. It's what's called in psychology your go, no, go. So if you get an impulse to do something, the ability to sit back and say, let me think about that. What are the risks and the benefits? What are the potential consequences? That stuff isn't finished completely till the age of 25. Organizing, planning, all the most sophisticated sort of higher human functions that we have really come out of the frontal cortex, which is the last part of the brain to mature. So why does any of this matter? Well, we now know a lot about addiction. So let me step back now and talk a bit about substance use and what we know about the brain. There have been tremendous strides in understanding the brain related to addiction. Huge explosion of new science which has happened in the last 20 years, partly from imaging studies and genetic studies. So we now know that these are the three major parts of the brain involved when people have substance use disorders. The part that was recognized first is this part. That's your pleasure center. That's the part that when you use drugs, you feel good, you feel high. So that's the part that was first discovered, the pleasure center of the brain. That's involved in addiction. That's also involved not only in the sensation of feeling good or feeling high when you use drugs, but it's also involved in craving, or the urge to have drugs comes from this part of the brain. But that's not the whole story. As I mentioned, the prefrontal cortex ends up being really important. So let's say you have an urge to have a drink. I prefer red ale, that's my favorite kind of beer. I love beer, so imagine I'm having an urge now to have a beer. I think, oh, that would taste really good. That urge would be coming here from my basal ganglia. Well, what happens is my prefrontal cortex then kicks in, and there starts to be sort of this communication back and forth between these systems, where my prefrontal cortex says, well, that would be good, but maybe it's not the best time, because you're standing in front of an audience, and maybe they would know, and maybe you should want to put that off till a later time. So I have this overriding mechanism that helps me when I have an urge to say, let me think through the pros and cons of this, and come to some decision. So you see, it's important sort of the balance between these two parts of the brain. And then there's a third part of the brain that's involved called the amygdala, and that's your mood center. So you could be doing really well and saying, okay, I'm really trying not to drink, I'm thinking about the consequences whenever I have an urge, and I'm managing not to drink, and then something really awful could happen to you, a trauma, a death in the family, or maybe you get depression for some reason. And so your mood is also a factor and tips the balance because these three systems are really interacting back and forth with each other. And you see how all those are factors in understanding use of substance even when people are having consequences, relapse back to substance, all kinds of different clinical kinds of examples. Does that make sense? So again, this is the binge intoxication reward part. This is the consequences part and planning, and then this is kind of related to depression, stress, mood. What happens when people use drugs for years and years, like they have a substance use problem? Now they're using drugs, even though they want to stop, they're having problems from drugs, they seem unable to stop. One of the things that we know happens is that the prefrontal cortex essentially flips. So instead of telling me to stop, the function becomes very impaired, where now my prefrontal cortex is just saying, you gotta get the drug, you gotta get the drug, you gotta get the drug. So there's also evidence of changes that happen in the context of repeated drug use that change some of the normal functioning from what it's supposed to be. So again, this is kind of just a summary of the main biological processes that and how we think about addiction now. Okay, so we mentioned that the brain goes through the final maturation, essentially from the back to the front. So what does that mean? Well, it means when you're a teenager, the impulse, sensation-seeking part of your brain develops first, before the planning and thinking part and consequences part. That's why teens are so vulnerable. Right? So you're a kid, neither one's really developed. In the teen years, again, the binge center, the excitement, the sensation seeking is now mature, and there's nothing to stop it in place. Because by the time you're 25, of course, there's the opposite, where now the prefrontal cortex is developed so it can put the stop mechanisms on. But you see, that's really the vulnerability of the teen right there, and the teen brain. So I'm an addiction psychiatrist. I speak a lot on addiction. I treat patients, and I always say, where are the pediatricians? Where are the child psychiatrists? child psychiatrists, interestingly, almost do nothing in substance abuse, which is strange to me because this is a childhood disorder. When you look at the onset of substance use, it's almost always 11, 12, 13. So there's so much more, in some ways, in thinking about prevention, how we could be including providers that help children to be more effective at prevention and early intervention. So, and you also see that the onset of alcohol, tobacco, and cannabis is essentially the same, although tobacco almost always is the first drug that somebody says that they've used in their life. But they're pretty closely related in time. So I'm going to talk about this for briefly, a little bit more about understanding the brain's processes in addiction. Why do people use substances? So we know substance abuse is a devastating disease. It ruins families, it ruins people's lives, it causes so many consequences. People overdose. Why do people use drugs? That's sort of the answer we're always seeking, trying to understand the disease better so we can develop better treatments. So I'm going to say this is kind of the old answer. Why do people use drugs? You can think of Nancy Reagan. Why do people use drugs? Well, to get high, right? Just say no. People use drugs to get high. It turns out that's actually not really true, but I'll explain that in a second. Why do people use drugs? Well, one reason they use drugs is to get high, and in psychology they call that positive reward. You use the drug, it feels good, so you do it again. You got a positive reward. We know a lot about the biology now. This is just a different picture, not to disorient you, kind of showing you the same thing I showed you before. This is as if we're looking at the brain kind of sliced down the middle, and you're standing to the side. So this is the middle of the brain. This is the front again, this is the back, this is the spinal cord. Again, to point out that the parts of the brain involved in substance use that give us reward or pleasure or seeking drugs is considered deep or primitive or old brain that lots of different species have. And then those parts connect to our other human brain like prefrontal cortex. So in this part of the brain, we know a lot about what happens when people use substances. When you use drugs, this part of the brain gets turned on. It's called the reward pathway. What does that mean, it gets turned on? It means in those parts of the brain, a chemical called dopamine is synthesized, and when you use drugs, it turns these pathways on and it causes the release or the dump of dopamine into this part of the brain. And we know that when dopamine gets released in this part of the brain, that's at least some of the high that people experience from drugs. So if you used cocaine, this is what would happen. Dopamine would be released in this part of the brain and you would feel good. It also happens with nicotine, heroin, any drug really that you can think of causes this reaction where dopamine gets released and you feel some pleasure or high from the drug. So this is just to point out again, this pathway is not for one drug. All drugs essentially activate this pathway and cause the release of dopamine in this part of the brain through different mechanisms. But basically the pathway is common for all drugs. Okay, so I said that some people use drugs, of course, to get high or to feel good for the positive reward. But when you look at someone's lifetime, over their entire life, it turns out that that's actually only a very small part of their life. Early in somebody's drug use life, they're using drugs to get high or to feel good. And maybe this is what corresponds with being a teenager or being in college, early in your life. The vast majority of people's lives, if they continue to use drugs, it seems that they're using drugs for a completely different reason. Which is called negative reinforcement, which is the concept that people are really using drugs most of the time to take away bad feelings. So again, it's not my theory. This comes from Koob, who's really one of the leading neurobiologists in this area. He's the head of NIAAA, the Alcohol Institute of the NIH. So again, the main theories at this point is that yes, people use drugs to get high in the beginning, but in fact, most behavior of continuing to use drugs and having addiction problems are often using drugs for these other reasons called negative reinforcement, which basically means using drugs to take away bad feelings. Well, can you say more about that? Yes. This ends up being super important, that this is really the main driver of why people use drugs, to take away bad feelings. So imagine if you used heroin every day for a year and you're addicted, you're tolerant to heroin, but today you say, today I'm going to quit heroin and start a new life. You would have overwhelming physical withdrawal, and that would make you miserable. You'd have cramping and diarrhea and all kinds of horrible vomiting, chills, and that's an example of negative reinforcement. When you feel that physical withdrawal, it's so unpleasant that it makes your body say, gotta find the drug, because I gotta make that bad feeling go away. So withdrawal in some ways is an example of this, using drugs to take away bad feelings. That's why we help people with treatment to break out of the cycle of withdrawal, because withdrawal gets in the way, makes people want to use drugs. But it's not the only example of negative reinforcement. Other things that probably contribute a lot to people's continuing use of drugs could include depression or a history of trauma. And maybe you can really extend that out and say, you know, what about poverty, neglect, social deprivation, right? Why do our poorest populations often have the most problems with substance use disorders? Maybe it's because people are using drugs to avoid bad feelings. It's kind of an interesting idea, and it reflects more of the current thinking right now about substance use. In fact, it turns out stress is a pretty important factor. You know, we all talk about having stress in our lives. And I've been working recently with college populations at Rutgers through the college counseling service. And so I've been looking at a lot of student in college patterns of substance use. And it turns out college students are very likely to drink on days when they say they experience stress. And on days that they have stress, not only are they more likely to drink, but they even have more drinks on those days than on days when they say they're not so stressed. And it's almost directly related. Now, unfortunately, kids who have high stress drinking, kids who drink when they're stressed, are much more likely than the other kids to go on and have an alcohol problem, an alcohol disorder or alcoholism. So it's kind of a risk factor of who's going to have more problems in the future. And, you know, the greatest difficulty in working with these college kids who stress drink is that they don't think they have an alcohol problem. I don't really have an alcohol problem, I have a stress problem. And so sometimes it's hard to engage them in substance treatment because they don't identify themselves as having a problem. But substance use is a big deal in youth populations, high school, college. There's lots of evidence of consequences to the student, like academic failure. These kids are more likely to have health and other mental health problems. There's all kinds of risks for fights and assaults and sexual assaults, unwanted, unplanned sex, overdose. So lots of negative consequences to the student, and also significant consequences to the school. It surprises me in learning about this kind of college campus environment. It surprises me that the schools don't do more, in fact, trying to limit some of the habits. There's the higher cost to the school, there's more vandalism, more need for safety. It could damage the school's reputation. So really very significant impact in the population. When you look at college populations, and this is relevant for high school as well, you see the same trends, which is that really we should always be talking about alcohol and marijuana. That almost 1 million college students on any given day in this country are using alcohol. That's a lot. And it's almost 1 million, it's 700,000 on any given day in any college in the US is using marijuana on a given day. These are so small in comparison, they're really here. See that? This is just an inset to show you. It doesn't mean that they're not a problem, but they're way smaller, right, than the elephant in the room of alcohol and marijuana. Binge drinking is a huge problem. It's really drinking to get drunk. Binge drinking is defined as 5 or more drinks for men or 4 for women in any sort of drinking episode. of just a few hours. It's important how you count your drinks, right? A red Solo cup isn't a drink. That's probably 2.5. So just thinking about how you quantify it. Just last week, another college student died from binge drinking. So these are in the news regularly. It's really a tragedy. Acute alcohol poisoning related to a fraternity. So cannabis, is obviously in the news. And I'm just going to briefly kind of touch on the different substances, but as I mentioned, I'm happy to take questions if you have them. One of the problems with the pot of today is that it's not the pot of 25 years ago. That's a really key point because the THC content has gone up so much. The THC content of pot, used to be about 4%. Most plants now, it's about 25%. And keep in mind, kids aren't even using pot, they're using the derivatives, THC oils and dabs, which can be 40 to 90% THC. So we don't really know the impact of that. We don't really fully understand. So we could say, well, if you smoked 4% cannabis, maybe you didn't really have a lot of consequences. Well, that's not necessarily the same as if you vape dabs or derivatives that are 40 to 90% THC. It's not the same drug. And that's a really important consideration, even in the context of talking about legalization and all the other stuff that's happening. Okay. THC, there's obviously a lot of science and research into cannabinoid receptors in our body, in our brain. What do they do? Can we harness any of that for medical reasons? Potentially, although again, the science is very early. This is just to show all the potential binding sites of THC in the brain, so you can imagine the potential is for a lot of impact, given that there are receptors in so many parts of the brain. It's not just impacting one part of the brain. What happens when teens use marijuana repeatedly? Well, we know that there are negative impacts in thinking in teens who use marijuana regularly in terms of memory and thinking. So let me just show you some of the studies. And again, this may not be relevant to adults, but the teen brain is different, and there is evidence of a negative impact on teen brain related to regular cannabis use. We know that when teens use cannabis every day, you can show loss of IQ points. So this was a study that was well done in New Zealand, following people for many years. And basically, this is saying these are teenagers. This is their IQ. This is teenagers who never use marijuana. And these are teenagers who use marijuana for 3 years or more. And you can say, well, look at the data. There's no difference. Marijuana doesn't hurt their brain. But that's not the whole story. Look at them at 38. By the time they're 38, they've now had a significant decline in IQ points compared to the group that didn't use cannabis. Sure. At the age of 13, these kids are already using cannabis for 3 or more years. They've already used basically since 10 on a regular or near daily basis. And you could say, well, when you measure them early in their teen years, their IQ is the same as a group that doesn't use marijuana. And you might conclude that it's not hurting the teen brain. But when you follow them for enough years, you can see the decline in IQ, that now by the time they're 38, right, their IQ's gone down about 7 points. Not necessarily every person, but as a group, they have suffered some loss of intellectual capacity and some brain power because of the pot use. What about dropout from school? Again, marijuana use is definitely associated with worse academic performance. So using marijuana in grade 10, right, they were so much more likely to drop out of school at the top, right? So this is when they started weekly marijuana. So regular marijuana use by 10th grade was associated with 6 times higher dropout rates compared to kids that started in 12th grade. So you see, the younger you get into this, and the more years you have, the more you're going to have a negative impact. What about mental illness? Well, again, we have known, I'm a psychiatrist, we have known for 50 years that when people use any substance, they are more likely to have anxiety, depression, sleep disorder. They're more likely to have mental illnesses that are actually caused or a direct result from the substances. And marijuana is no different. There's ample evidence that when people use marijuana chronically or daily, they have 2 to 7 times higher risk than other populations for developing anxiety, depression, and illnesses with psychosis, which have been in the news lately, where people lose reality, they get paranoid, they hallucinate. Those are quite serious mental illnesses. And some causality has been linked to marijuana. It doesn't mean everyone that uses marijuana gets it, but it's a much higher risk. So for example, if you already have someone in your family that had schizophrenia, so you have a higher risk already because you have a genetic risk, it's in your family, those teenagers should never smoke pot heavily, because the 2 hits of the family history and the heavy pot will almost certainly cause those children to have a psychotic illness like schizophrenia. It's quite serious and severe. What about driving? And again, some of this is controversial. Does use of marijuana cause more accidents? There's sort of data on both sides of this. But there is evidence when you put people into a driving simulator, like a computer machine, and they practice driving under the influence of cannabis, you can show that it impairs people's attention, their working memory, their coordination, their reaction time, and their visual perception. And of course, there's always the risk for addiction. So using, I meet college students now, unfortunately, every day, every week, who tell me that they smoke pot every single day. And they don't see it as a problem, or they rationalize it one way or another. And regular use like that is much more likely to have a substance use problem. So cannabis itself, you could say, well, the overall risk of developing an addiction to cannabis, maybe you would say it's not so high, it's 9%. But it already goes up to 17% if you start as a teenager. And then it goes up to almost 50% if you're a teenager who smokes every day. So that's like saying maybe half of the kids today who are smoking every day in high school and college are addicted to it. So it's not trivial. Okay, I'm jumping around a little bit, but I can also speak about some of the new tobacco products and e-cigarettes. I'm sure you're familiar with the Juul, which sort of came out of nowhere a few years ago. It's a new technology. It's called a nicotine salt. It's quite discreet. It looks like a memory stick, so if it's in your pencil case, right, your parents don't know that you have an e-cigarette. It charges on a USB port, and it has a very high nicotine level in it. It comes in fun flavors like fruit medley, mango, creme brulee, and cool mint. Interestingly, when they give them to kids and they do research studies, it turns out that kids really dislike the flavor Virginia tobacco. Which is great, and that's why some of the movement in this country and discussion should be about banning the flavors. Like, you might notice that now when you go into a store, the cigars are like cherry crush flavor and Oreo flavor. And did your dad and your grandpa really want Oreo flavor cigars? Who's that a product that's being marketed? It's clearly marketing to teens who are very sensitive to the flavors. There's pushback from the industry. The FDA's been talking about banning flavors, but then there's always pushback and it doesn't get done. But the fact that kids don't like Virginia tobacco flavor is sort of helpful, that if you didn't have these attractive flavors, they would probably be less attractive to teens. The nicotine amount that you can get from a Juul is so high that it's almost identical to a cigarette. And 10 years ago, that technology was thought to be impossible, that you couldn't come up with something that gave you as much drug as a cigarette, because the cigarette is so good at putting nicotine in your body. But now we know that the Juul is almost as good. So kids, when they use Juuls, they say, oh, I feel super buzzed. And you know, I have to ask all the teenagers that I see so I can understand this as a scientist, what it feels like. And they say, you know, you feel a little lightheaded or sick to your stomach. And I say, that's nicotine toxicity, right? You're getting such a high nicotine level in your body that it actually doesn't feel good, but you're interpreting that as a buzz. What do we know about kids who use e-cigarettes? Well, early studies seem to suggest these kids are more likely to go on and smoke regular cigarettes, and that's a concern. They may be also more likely to go on and use cannabis more than their peers, and that's a concern. So there's some risks with the e-cigarette, but the greatest risk is that it could be a gateway really to other substances. So, I probably talked a little too fast. But I went over a lot of different ideas. I'm happy to answer any questions about any of this or show you some of the pictures again if you want me to go over something again. Substance use really is clearly a brain disease. People use drugs both for positive and negative reward or reinforcement. The adolescent brain is not fully developed until 25, and so we have to really think about protecting the vulnerable adolescent brain from substances. I'm not a hardcore prohibitionist. I don't believe that those kind of approaches work, but I feel really strongly that we have to protect the brain until people are 25 years old. In fact, some of this, the discussion about legalization of cannabis, and I don't think this is likely to happen here or maybe in any state, but some people have really put out there, why don't we make the legal age 25? Based on information like this, which I think is an interesting idea. I don't think it will happen, but I think it's an interesting way to think about some of this information. So I will stop, and I'm happy to take any questions you may have. Yes?
What is the percentage not the high school drug use? Not the high school.
I do not work at the high school, and I do not know those numbers, and I do not know if it's tracked. Remember, these studies come from surveys where they kind of protect people's anonymity, their identity, national samples. So I don't know that Nutley tracks that data in any kind of systematic way. We wouldn't be able to get it out
anyway, even if we had it. That's pretty information, but
how in general?
I can't even give you estimates. I don't think that would be fair.
So the newest data on these...
If I could just add respectfully as another resident and somebody, well, not only somebody who grew up in Nutley, and I'm sure Joanne can talk to this about the 70s, I think it's been pretty consistent. Nobody's hiding the fact. We are not going to tell you we're drug-free. We're not that dumb. In fact, I'd like my wife to go back to the Juul part, because there's an element of the Juul piece that we have an issue with right now, where they're adding THC oil to that, and there's actually YouTube videos to show kids how to do that. So we are up against it quite heavily, like any other town, I think, and Nutley's not unique.
So the most current data in this country shows that 30% of high school students are vaping. It feels even higher than that, frankly. It's felt like almost 50%. I think, just from my daughter's high school experience.
40%. I would say 40%.
And his high school
if I would give you the latest
it's
estimate.
probably somewhere in there, 30 to 50% by the time their 12th graders are vaping. And that's a big number and reason to be alarmed.
How do they access the marijuana oil? And actually, like, how do they access? I thought that the Juuls were.
Of course you do, but you can go in anywhere and get them in town.
So legal age. So what are the issues with legal age? So stores routinely illegally sell to minors. I think the tobacco violations are much greater than the alcohol violations. And frankly, the state doesn't do as many sort of stings as other states. So some states are quite active in sending teens out to try to buy tobacco in stores, to try and bust the store. New Jersey hasn't had a lot of budget for that in recent years, so we don't do as much monitoring as some states. So teens would tell you it's quite easy. They know which store will sell. In terms of how you get hash oil and THC oil, you know, it's hard to know. The high schools seem to have sources. You know, I don't know if that's from recent graduates or how exactly that comes in. But remember, medical cannabis makes it all much more available. It's more likely to be in grandma's home or, you know, your friend's home, and so just the absolute supply, you would think, has to be higher, at least in part from some medical use, although not entirely.
You spoke about the probability of developing mental disorders the longer you smoke marijuana. Is that based on if you started as an adolescent before your frontal lobe develops, or is it, say you start smoking it in college, you know, what's the difference?
So there's always a risk. Even an adult can develop anxiety or depression from heavy use of a substance. And I mean heavy, maybe years, every day. So that potential is always there. The risk, I would say, is almost certainly higher, though, for a young adult. They have more vulnerability. You know, you could argue they have not as good coping skills already because they're not an adult and they haven't experienced as much. That might even make them more vulnerable to that. The other thing, though, to keep in mind is, remember, we are working right now with old marijuana science about the risk when the plant was 4% of the drug, 4% drug. And now 20 to 80% drug combinations, we just don't really know. We won't know for 20 years the real risk and how that's going to affect the population in a big way. We really won't know for a long time. Early studies are showing the higher the THC content, the higher the risk. So for example, in the UK, they always have better data than we do because National Health Service and stuff, so they have all this science and data in more detail on people than we sometimes are able to get in this country. And in London, for example, they were noticing certain neighborhoods were having all of these new cases of people with psychosis, people with hallucinations and delusions and looking like they have schizophrenia. And that mapped almost completely onto the neighborhood level of THC content. That the neighborhoods with the 80% THC were showing the most psychosis. So there seems to be a relationship in the THC content that's related to the risk. That may end up being the most important factor. But again, we just don't have enough science or experience about that yet.
Regarding the THC, because that was one of the questions I had, is there a regulation on how much THC that they could actually put in marijuana?
Well, a state could develop that as part of their state law, but I don't think it's regulated in any of the current legalized states. Like, I don't think Colorado or Washington or those states have a limit.
I was thinking about the motor vehicle accidents. So, I think you said that there really wasn't a correlation.
So
all the things you listed seem like.
So the car accident data and the ER data has been controversial. Are there more ER visits now that cannabis has been legal and is being used more? And there's kind of controversy about whether or not that shows it. The one finding that's coming out of that ER visits that seems to be true is that more people who take edibles go to the ER. Like, so if there's an increase in ER visits related to cannabis, it's typically people who used edibles. Because the onset is slow and people take in more. If you vape THC and you feel the effect instantly, you regulate how much you take. But if you take edibles and you don't feel the effect for 2 hours, you can really overdose accidentally. So ER visits related to edibles are going up. Car accident data is controversial. Is it worse? Is it not worse in states with legalization? The issue is that when people drive high, again, the data that I showed you where they're impaired comes from like a driving simulator lab where you can show that they seem to be impaired. Pot high drivers drive really slow. They say it's not the guy who speeds by you like an alcoholic or is wavering. It's like the person going 20 miles an hour. It's almost like a joke that people make. That people drive so slow because they're high. Maybe they don't get in accidents. It's a little bit controversial. There isn't really clear data one way or another. Certainly everybody's worried about that, and there's no way for a police officer to be able to tell, right? There's no equivalent of a breathalyzer, right? If you had marijuana in your system, it could be from 3 weeks ago. So that's the great difficulty for law enforcement to be able to make a decision at the moment. People are trying to develop a test like that, and whoever does will get very rich. But so far, there's no technology for that. So it is a bit controversial about whether or not there are more car accidents related to
Because
pot.
of the speed, really. I mean.
Right, and if they slow down, they might still be a hazard, but everybody moves around them. So it's not clearly known.
So once legislation, if they pass the regulation for marijuana in the state of New Jersey, how does that, from your standpoint of looking at it as a long term, how does that affect checking urine, toxicology for the kids that work, and moving forward for even adults who are working in an industry where, you know, their jobs are contingent on these kinds of tests?
It's really confusing.
Yeah.
And so remember, the federal law still trumps the state law. So for example, at Rutgers, which is a university, they receive federal dollars. So even if marijuana is legal in New Jersey, technically it'll still be illegal related to Rutgers or on campus because the federal law and the federal money is the precedent. So there's confusion and gaps in how this all happens. Any other questions or comments? Okay, well, I hope it has been helpful, and it was nice of you all to come out tonight, and I'll be around if you have any other things you'd like to talk to me about. Thank you.